pay 1,000 life points. Special summon one level 5 or lower fusion monster from your fusion deck, and in parentheses, this special summon is treated as a fusion summon. Well, now before we go on, quick shout out to my friends over at Universal Legends. They funded the previous video, and their Kickstarter is about halfway done. And, you know, I would like to see them make it across the finish line. They are longtime friends of the channel, and I'd like to see their game, you know, get done, make it happen. It's an any card as resource game, but it does have some interesting mechanics. There's the stacking mechanic that allows you to combine, like, weaker minions together. The one I like the most, though, is called Spark, where it's an any card as resource game, but a bunch of those cards are basically trap cards, which you can pay, like, a fee of some kind, and then you can play it from your resource row. I think it's a really cool mechanic, mostly in that I feel it's balanced because it shreds some of your resources in order for that to happen. And you know how, like, a Magic the Gathering game can just, like, go on forever, and there's, like, 12 lands in play that you're just doing nothing with? Imagine if, like, a ton of those lands could be, you know, not just cracked like a fetch land, but cracked to, like, become a monster or an instant or an enchantment. That's kind of one of the big themes of this deck. It is an any card of resource game, but it actually, like, adds to that mechanic, which is why I really like it. So, anyways, getting into the video, I am so glad that this one went over so much better than the other one. As of recording, it is not yet August 26th, so we do not know if they are in fact going to bolt the bird. But I think I managed to get it, like, in the right time. I was able to, you know, a lot of people have explained why Nadu should be banned, but, you know, I actually, like went further afield to explain other things, like, setting it up with Butterfly Dagger Elma to explain how, like, bottomless equipment can become a problem. There's, like, other bottomless equipment, like Lightning Greaves. I believe there's, like, a +1 sword, which is sort of like one of, like, the commander equivalents. Nadu is also up for discussion for a ban in commander, because, yes, there are, like, 200 cards that can turn into gold, and that, you know, kind of curb stomps commander. But I guess we could talk about some other things that are going on. So one of the things, first of all, the reason that a ban list should exist in the first place, the clip where the guy says, step 1 to having no friends, or first step to having no friends, I'm pretty sure it's step 1 to having no friends, that is a video from Soul Calibur 4, and I remember that video when it was new, and it stayed with me because it sums up perfectly why you have to have a ban list. Because here's the thing, it is not fun to play against a deck that just has a humongous advantage over everything else in the field, or like a fighting game character with a huge advantage. But the thing is, if you choose to use that character with the broken combo that you know how to do, you're called cheap. But if you don't, if you choose, like, a different character or, like, a different deck, you're considered insulting. It's like, oh, am I not worthy to fight you at your best? And it's like, oh, come on, man, stop being so cheap. So it's kind of a conundrum where you're expected to use the broken maneuver, but, you know, are criticized for doing so. So this is why a ban list exists, for the health of the game, because what it does is it both removes that cheap tactic and removes the pressure to use it. So it opens up the field, it allows people to finally be, like, more expressive with their decks again, and like I said, that clip kind of haunted me because of how perfectly whoever made it put the situation they found themselves in. Although, speaking of, something I did not really talk about is the concept of restricted cards. Now, a lot of games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Digimon will, rather than banning a card outright, instead limit the number of cards, copies of a card you can use in your deck. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has tons of restricted cards. I'm not sure of any that Magic has. Magic has a few in, like, the Legacy and, like, Eternal formats, like the Moxen are limited in, like, their most broken format. Digimon has a few that are limited. But the idea is, if you can wipe out the consistency of a strategy, if you are able to make it so that a setup only happens every once in a while rather than, like, consistently every single game, in theory, you can bring that deck under control. That is something that Yu-Gi-Oh! Does a lot, although, like I said, that kind of ties in with how they use the ban list as, you know, their form of set rotation. But Instant Fusion, I did leave out that Instant Fusion is technically these days limited to 1 in a deck, although I do not think that is because of Tyrant Neptune. Although apparently it was at 3 when Tyrant Neptune was reaching Havoc. Both this card and Tyrant Neptune were at 3. So if you dedicated the rest of your deck to just getting those 2 cards in your hand, then you could easily set them up on turn 1 and win either on that turn if you went second or the next turn if you went first. The problem is if you only need 1 copy of the card to win and it's really easy to ferret out like Cyberstein, then limiting that to just 1 copy isn't really going to do anything to help you. So that's why Cyberstein was forbidden. There I go back to the Man and the Monster video. I did a good job on that one. I should make more like that one. Another thing I might have left out is it's not really Butterfly Dagger Elma that led to the creation of the hard once per turn, but it was likely the Infernity archetype, which was like the biggest threat to the game after Teledad was taken apart. So yeah, I figured I'd address that here. Although while I'm here, maybe I should talk about, some other cards. Some cards got banned really quickly. Some were actually banned before they were even released or limited before they were even released. One of the cards that I would like to talk about that I actually feel like I should have talked about was Painful Choice from Yu-Gi-Oh! What Painful Choice does is you basically search your deck for 5 cards, you create 2 piles, and your opponent gets to choose which one you keep and which one goes to the discard pile. So that's supposed to be a card with an upside and a downside to counteract that. Unfortunately, because of how easy it is to interact with the graveyard in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it turned from a card with an upside and a downside to a card that instead had 2 upsides. So you need to pay attention to that. Because like, oh boy, I get to fill my graveyard with all the cards I want to play and maybe get the cards in my hand that I want. It's the same situation with the Magic the Gathering card Gifts Ungiven, although Gifts Ungiven has its own story that I'm, again, going to leave to Touristic Studies. But Painful Choice is an example where you think you've given a card a nerf, but it is, in fact, a buff, so you have to pay attention to that. Same with Gearfried the Iron Knight. It's supposed to be like a nerf or like something that protects it from the card Snatch Steal, which was fairly prominent when the card came out, but turned out to be a buff all around. Some cards that were banned really quickly. There was Memory Jar from Urza's, I believe it was Urza's Legacy or Urza's Destiny. It was from the Urza block. It was a card that was banned in less than 3 weeks because it kind of functions like Time Twister, and you saw the whole story about how Time Twister absolutely destroys games. Apocalypse, a card from the Digimon card game, was actually a huge problem in Japan before its international release. So there was actually an announcement that it was going to be limited, not banned, like before the set that contained it was ever released. So that's like another case where the desire to sell a new set kind of outweighs the desire to ban. Is that this is a set that had not come out internationally yet, and if you like ban this card, that's like the real reason people are going to want to buy the set. I mean, cutting Apocalypse down to 1 does heavily damage its consistency because its effect is that it uses Dark Masters cards in your discard pile to bring itself into play. But if you can only do that once, then that severely hinders how often that card can do that. Although the fastest banning I've ever seen was Lutri the Spell Chaser from the Ikoria set. That card was actually banned before release in the Commander format. Now, I do understand that the Commander format is technically run by, a sort of different group of people, but you have to imagine how Wizards interpreted what is essentially a shot across the bow at their current design space when they have an entire card that, just was banned before the set even came out. I knew there was a Magic the Gathering card that was like that, but yeah, it was Lutri, the Is It Otter and their jug banned Christmas. But, although there's more otters because of Bloomborough now. But, they saw this thing as such a huge threat thanks to its, companion feature, which was also an effect that got errated. You no longer get to cast it outside of the game for free. You get to add it to your hand from your sideboard for 3. Hey, that rhymes. But the whole companion mechanic was pretty badly busted, and that was, Magic the Gathering, they make mistakes, and the problem is because they now have eternal formats, those mistakes tend to linger. Magic has a ton of different formats. I mean, Pokemon technically has a legacy format, but nobody actually plays it, and the only cards in there that are banned are ones that were banned in Standard anyway. So it's like they just, add the ban list from standard into their legacy format. But Magic, they have like modern, commander, and pioneer, and standard, I guess, pauper, all sorts of crazy stuff. And I imagine that is, harmful to their design space. Magic is a game that's constantly wanting to experiment with monetization lately, to be honest. But they're constantly wanting to try out new things, and the pressure to make things that appeal to other sets, that appeal to like all the formats, I imagine the pressure is kind of high there. This is a bed that they have made, and now they get to lie in it. Although, if we're going to talk errata text, like I talked about with how they changed how Companion works, I talked about errata text and how later printings of Rock Egg clarified how Rock Egg was supposed to work. That's really the purpose of errata text, is to clarify when a card's effect was written in error and to instead properly convey the intentions behind it. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of errata. It's usually something that also kind of tweaks the card. A lot of cards were brought off the ban list when they were errated to be once a turn, or errated to only use different materials. Like, I know Firewall Dragon and Goyo Guardian were taken off the ban list because they were given some additional restrictions on how they work so that they actually properly match the intent of what the card was supposed to be at some point. I took a look at their list. The only erratas I see that like actually change how the card works was like Sinister Serpent, which actually had new effects on it now. A famous one was Imperial Order. Imperial Order, it's a trap that makes it so that no spell cards can be played, and at the start of your turn you have to pay 700 life points or it goes away. So that gives you the opportunity to set it off on your opponent and then let it lapse on your turn so you get to use spells again. They changed that from optional to mandatory. So you have to pay the life cost and it has to stay in play, but it still turned out to be busted and it's still banned even after the errata. Although, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but do you recall the most strangest errata of all? So, Lorcana, here we are. I'm going to finally talk about it again. So, in the very first expansion Lorcana ever produced, they created Bucky Squirrel Squeak Tutor. And it basically broke the game in something called Squirrel Control. So the first ever expansion for Lorcana was called Rise of the Floodborn. So of course they introduced a new archetype called Floodborn, and because they needed to sell cards, they made Floodborn really powerful by giving it an absolutely busted card to work with. So what Bucky does is it has the effect that as long as it is in play, when you play a Floodborn card, your opponent, or actually it says each opponent chooses and discards a card. So even in multiplayer, this thing is a bomb. So it's like a small creature with a really good effect, right? That's supposed to balance it, but the thing is, Bucky also has an effect called Ward. Now, what Ward does is it is basically a weaker version of the same protection as Independent Nightingale. It cannot be targeted for card effects. It can still be affected by like field wipes or things that affect the entire board or something like that, but you cannot hit it with like a single target destruction effect or anything like that. So the only way that this thing could be opened up to be destroyed is if it was in battle. But the only way it would be opened up to be battled is if the person who owns this card decides to swing with it. And why would they do that and lose their perfectly good combo engine? The thing that bothers me about this card is that it is indicative of so many of the problems that Lorcana has. It's a lot of it is the struggle to interact with moves your opponent is doing. Like, when it's not your turn, you can honestly just get up and walk away. There are so few things you can do on your opponent's turn. Like, less than Magic, less than Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't think there's any hand traps in Lorcana or anything like that. Hand traps or instant speeds. It's one of the reasons that I prefer blocker abilities over taunt abilities, is because blocker abilities give the player who controls them the volition on whether they want to use them or not. But this card got an errata, and let's take a look at it. Hold on, that is not an errata. That's an entirely new card. The ability is different, the play cost is different, The lack of keyword is different. The only thing that this card carries over from the previous one is the picture and the stat line. Otherwise, that's not an errata. That is a completely new card. And that, sparked a whole heap of controversy, and I'm pretty sure I know exactly why they handled it like this, rather than what they probably should have done, which is ban Bucky and print this card as like a new one in the new set with the new ability and all that. The reason I am sure that they errataed Bucky into being an entirely new card is because they desperately do not want to have a banning in their first year on the books. I think they imagine that having a card actually be straight up banned would be bad for the game's image, and that's why they did it that way. Honestly, it's starting to feel like, Lorcana certainly lasted longer than I thought it would, I'll admit it, but it definitely feels like the honeymoon is over in regards to this game. Like, I know there was a set Into the Inklands, and I know stores that still have stock of that are struggling to sell through it, and are now just absolutely drowning in stuff for, the Ursula set. It's a wild experience. So, yeah, there are tons of reasons why you might ban a card. Honestly, I feel like it takes, more guts to admit when you have a problem. That's just a fact of life in general. To admit when you have a problem, than to try to, cover it up by basically, trying to pretend that this whole thing didn't exist. But yeah, this is why a ban list should exist, is because if a card is causing problems in your game, if it's not because of a mistake in like card text, like if you parsed something out wrong, so something that's supposed to be once per turn actually becomes an infinite, then you should probably bring down the ban hammer for the sake of your game's future and longevity. Because if there is nothing in your new sets that can compete with this broken combo, why would anybody buy it? So yeah, that is I guess that's all they have to say about banning. I have some other ideas going on. For example, starting a game with no budget. Over on the Discord, I finally finished a game. I'm gonna start doing some playtests on it over there. I am actually like entertaining the idea of doing a game jam, and yeah, go ahead and give Universe of Legends your support. And until next time, this is Kodak signing off.